Hello, this is a walk through the fantasy journal I created. It's a happy, upbeat fantasy journal. It hasn't got wizards and witches, it's got fairies and butterflies and happy fantasy things. So there's your first fairy on the outside. She's actually one of two fairies who are coming out of magic tents that are on the cover. So inside there's your fairy again, and at the first page, a kind of misty scene and a little description of what you'll find, the images of pixies and elves and fairies hiding away. So that's how it begins. And then inside there's a fairy, fairly chunky fairy, but she's a fairy. And you'll find I found images that are both modern, contemporary, and slightly old-fashioned of fairies. There's often text written over there, so you can write in the spaces around if you like, or you can just enjoy the pages for what they are. So there are lines for you to write on, somebody in a magic tree, and there's a fairy swinging in it. And then there are little cards with fairies, or almost fairies, on them, and you can write on the back. Here is a tea-stained page, or a coffee-stained page, I think actually this one, because it's more even. To give some texture and to make it more interesting and feel a little bit more lived in. More fairies dancing, and there's her reflection. Just never quite know where you'll find fairies. So there's fairies there and fairies there. And there's a fairy dancing on the lake. Another card. There are little charms with sort of elfin creatures on them to keep your place. And this one's actually holding in a picture of a flower fairy who seems to be more butterfly than fairy almost, with the clover. And frog prints. So this one hasn't got many pages for writing, but it does have an enormous number of cards for writing your secret fantasies. Another fairy, another pixie sort of wandering around there. More fairies hiding. More fairies in the morning mist with the ponies. So it is a very fantastical journal. There are places to just write little things if you want to, but my intention is and expectation is that you'll write more on the backs of these little cards that you can then hide away than possibly writing on the pages. There's another fairy dancing on the lake. More fairies inside. Fairy castle. Fantasy island. So there's a bit of writing space there, and there's space there if you wanted to write, and you can write the bits that you like the look of. There's a baby fairy with a rose, and fairy wings floating through. Fairy waiting over the pink grass for you. More fairies hiding away. As you can see, they're mostly kindly fairies doing things in a sort of fantasy fairy kind of way. There's nothing scary, so there's angels' wings. So if you wanted to give this to a child, I don't think there's anything that would scare them. It's a very sort of 1930s sort of fairy outside a hobbit hole, maybe? Lots and lots of fairies, just kind of in there, in the background. And more space if you wanted to write something. A lovely fairy in a doily card there, and fairies in the park with the pea fairies underground. Fairies having a quick chat somewhere, and a fairy kind of overlaid there. Fairy standing on the dock, writing. Some sort of mystery rider coming through the dawn. Fairies and boats. Lovely fantasy fairy image there with lambs. It's got a sort of bohemian 1900s kind of vibe to it, as well as having quite contemporary images. The hobbit hole and somebody blowing fairy dust, and a fairy uplifting and freeing her fairy friends. So it's all very gentle and jolly. More fairies, pixies possibly having a chat with a farmer, another place to possibly write. Another fairy scene, more fairies in a looks like a very tropical location. Fairies, children looking at the fairies. Some music, fairy whispers, nocturne. Another fairy hiding there in the So there's places to write, but there aren't too many, because I think this is going to be sort of a journal for people who are still finding their feet for writing, and you might feel more comfortable writing on the back of the card that you can then tuck away, so it's not so conspicuous if somebody else finds it. So there's the modern household fairy. I thought she was rather fun, even if she's got a huge bar of soap. More fairies dancing. A fairy queen with her court of beetles. Another fairy in a sort of fantasy flower image. Fairy from the front. Another fairy releasing fairies. So as you can see, it's got a very gentle fairy theme, but there are fairy creatures just kind of in there, and it's up to you to look through and see if you can find them. So there's fairies advertising. A fairy having a pensive moment. Well, it's an angel, isn't she? And a little fairy prince. So this is the fantasy journal. For those who would like to have more of a fantasy life than you currently have, who just like fantasy things, who enjoyed fairy stories as a child, whatever you like.